Christof Rühl joins us now. He's the head of global research for ADIA in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. But again, looking at global research around the world, looking at investments. A lot of talk about investments at this conference. Tell me, where's the big investment issues at the moment?
I think what people are talking about is, for them, the big issue is whether there's an investment gap. The theory being that 2014-15 oil prices crashed, nobody invested anymore. So therefore, according to the old logic, there has to be a supply gap coming up in 5, 6, 7 years, depending on what you believe about gestation periods. Then there is a footnote issue to that for most people, although I think it's much more interesting, which is the time horizon of investments. So we're used to, as I said, 5, 6, 7 for deep water, 7, 8, 9 years gestation periods between when you talk about the investment, the FID it, and when you actually get oil from it. Now with shale, that year and year long period has come down to a matter of months. And then personally, for me, there's also something else very interesting happening, but people don't talk about it so much. That is that this time where we had clear-cut producer countries and consumer countries and then very different impact of oil price movements in those countries seemed to be over. For example, oil price goes up, oil price goes down. There seemed to be no influence on the global economy anymore. Why is that? And I think because these days big producer countries are also big consumers. Look at the Middle East, look at Russia, look at Nigeria. These are no longer places in the desert where you have a well and then a hotel and nobody else. So whatever happens to prices affects consumer side of things. And big consumer countries, look at the US, look at Brazil, look at Canada, look at Norway, so are also big producer countries, right? So the days where the gasoline price falls and these economies get a big shot in the arm because people drive to the gas station and they find out they can gasoline for half the price and then they go and buy themselves a TV and boost the economy. They're probably over when at the same time in another part of the country the lower prices mean that your nephew loses his job and then knocks on your door and says, can you help him? Well, that affects the impact of lower and higher oil prices as we know them.
So, but when we look at those different dynamics, and they're hugely different because it was very clear-cut years ago, there were producers and there were consumers, and we also look at how people are we look at India right now and the growth that's there and the growth in consumers that's here. And also we look at the relationships with the International Energy Agency and that. But tell me just a little bit what you think in terms of the dynamics that have shifted. What impact does that make? And are people taking that seriously enough? Because it's a very different dynamic than we looked at years ago.
So of these three issues, the supply gap, that would be a big impact if indeed we run out of oil a few years from now because of an overly fast reaction. In my opinion, it's not going to happen. There's a lot of brouhaha for organizations who need to agree on something and need to raise red flags somewhere. The issue of the amplitude of the cycle being changed because of shale, which reacts as a matter of months, not as a matter of years, that's a serious one. It's still not clear what that means to the long, oil cycle as we know it, the 10 years feast and 10 years famine cycle. That may be under threat, I don't know, I will see. And then the third one is a really long-term structural change that will become more important and will be pronounced also in countries like India or China who are now you could say, they're just completely old-fashioned consumer countries. For the following reason, that as we move away into renewables are much more local. And as we have more and more renewables in the energy mix, even in developing countries who import otherwise everything, you will see that a lot more energy is being produced in consuming countries because you can't get the wind and the sun across borders very easily, only in the form of electricity, and that's limited compared to hydrocarbons. So that's a trend which will continue independently of the hydrocarbon sector.
So a lot of new dynamics to play in the industry. Here for the few days here in India with the International Energy Forum, how did you feel the dialogue was going? I mean, where did you see the concern from the ministers, from the CEOs? There was a lot of great discussion here. But I think everybody has got to the point where energy efficiency is now the norm. They've all put a lot of effort into cutting back on costs and really producing at lower costs. The OPEC situation at the moment and the OPEC, non-OPEC situation, taking those barrels off the market, do you believe that has actually helped the industry?
Define industry. It has helped those who have something to sell and get a higher price, and it has hurt those who have to buy something for a higher price. It's the same game as always. If you ask for my impressions, so there are some interesting cross currents indirectly reflecting what we just said. For example, there seems to be almost no disagreement in this consumer-producer dialogue On the institutional side, when you hear the IEA and OPEC talking, they're worried exactly about the supply gap as if it concerns both of them in the same way. The interesting part is, of course, these are both institutions as we know them for many decades in existence. Everybody knows what they do within the old fossil structure. So, meanwhile, there is a change going on, and it's reflected by many of the energy ministers who are here, who actually don't seem to be complete experts in oil and gas and have much more their mindset on renewables and electricity. Because they're politicians, maybe, because they're ahead of their time, maybe, who knows, but definitely from a sort of different kind of spectrum. And the connection between the two is not really been made. That's nobody's fault. It's nothing to do with the IEF. As I said, this is just an expression of big changes going on underneath the surface, and the old and the new still don't know quite how to talk to each other, and that's of course also a little bit present here. So that I find funny. Otherwise, I mean, it's a polite discussion. It's a very useful discussion. I'm very happy that the dialogue takes place at all, and it's actually no longer just ministers talking around table. So that's a very positive thing. And I think to have it in a country like India adds to that's what needs to be done, because this is where education has to happen. This is where the industry has to grow, and that's where we need to figure out whether the new industry is actually hydrocarbon or not.
And just finally, when we look at the role of the IEF and how it's changed over the years, and it's really, I mean, this conference is huge, and it even looks very different too. But the role of the IEF and really its relevance and, its need, its use these years, I mean, how important is that, do you think?
Well, first of all, honestly, I'm not known for mincing words, but a big compliment to my friend Dr. Sun. I know he has sometimes his own way of acting and talking and everything, but he did a great job so far since he's at the IEF, and getting different people together, getting them to talk and being a little less bureaucratic / diplomatic than it used to be the case, and I think that's absolutely healthy. And that is, I think, a great bone, and we see testament of that everywhere here. And secondly, I think as a forum, with convening power, and so it's essential that we have institutions like that. As I try to indicate, sometimes a bit less diplomacy, a bit more controversy. That's where ideas ultimately come from, would not hurt. But over the last few years, that's certainly actually the way the institution has gone. And there's still some way to travel, but it's a good development.